The throne room of Emperor IX stretched for nearly a mile, its ceiling so high that clouds sometimes formed beneath the golden arches. 17 species knelt before the emperor's platform, each one bringing tribute from their conquered worlds. Gems from the mines, rare metals from the forges, living sculptures from the artists of Prime, forced to create beauty for masters they despised. Emperor sat upon a throne carved from a single piece of crystal, harvested from the core of a dying star. His scales shimmered with the deep purple of royalty, and his 4 eyes surveyed his subjects with the casual boredom of absolute power. The hegemony had ruled 40 star systems for 1,000 years. No species had ever successfully rebelled. No enemy had ever threatened their borders. The hegemony was eternal. Everyone knew this. "The tribute from Sector 7 is acceptable," announced, his voice amplified by ancient technology to reach every corner of the vast chamber. "The quota will increase by 15% next cycle. Their minds have proven more productive than anticipated." The delegate, a small creature with 6 limbs and skin like cracked stone, lowered its head even further. Its species had once been great mathematicians and philosophers. Now they dug rocks from the ground until their bodies broke. No had lived past 40 years since the hegemony arrived on their world. "Your wisdom guides us all, great emperor," the delegate whispered. Was about to dismiss the assembly when the doors at the far end of the throne room burst open. A junior communications officer ran toward the throne platform, his scales flushed with the orange of extreme distress. Guards moved to intercept him, but the officer kept shouting. "Beacon activation. Resource reserve 7412. The quarantine beacon has activated." The emperor raised one clawed hand and the guard stepped back. He studied the trembling officer with mild curiosity. "Explain yourself. What is resource reserve 7412? The officer fumbled with a data tablet, his claws shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. "A primitive world, great emperor. Outer spiral arm. It was 300 years ago by Scout Admiral. The dominant species had barely achieved atmospheric flight at the time. The beacon was placed to alert us if they ever developed faster-than-light capability." A ripple of amusement passed through the assembled delegates and courtiers. Some of them had been conquered when their species developed FTL travel. It was almost a rite of passage in the galaxy. A new species would reach for the stars, full of hope and wonder, only to discover that the hegemony was waiting for them. "So the primitives have finally learned to walk," said, leaning back in his throne. "How quaint. What do we know of them?" The officer scrolled through his tablet. "They call themselves humans, great emperor. Their world is called Earth. At the time they were engaged in numerous conflicts among themselves. Scout Admiral noted they seemed unusually aggressive for a species that had not yet left their own atmosphere." "Aggressive," tasted the word. "How delightful. It has been some time since we had a species worth breaking. Dispatch the 14th Suppression Fleet. Remind these humans of their place in the natural order." The communications officer bowed so low his snout touched the floor. "It shall be done, great emperor." 3 weeks later, Admiral stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Crushing Tide, as his fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system. 12 warships followed his command, each one capable of reducing a continent to glass. The 14th Suppression Fleet had crushed rebellions on 9 worlds. They had never failed. "Scan the system," ordered. "Find their fleet." His sensor officer, a young female with promising ambition, worked her console for several minutes. Then she looked up with confusion in her eyes. "Admiral, I detect no military vessels, no orbital platforms, no defense satellites." She checked her readings again. "The planet shows signs of advanced civilization, massive cities, global communication networks, but their space presence is minimal. A few stations in orbit, some primitive vessels around their moon." Admiral felt the first stirring of unease. A species that had activated a quarantine beacon must have developed FTL travel. Where were their ships? Perhaps they are hiding, his second-in-command suggested. New species often make foolish tactical choices. Perhaps, studied the blue world on his. It was pretty, he supposed. Blue and green and white. It would make an excellent addition to the hegemony's holdings. Take us in. Standard suppression formation. We will establish orbit and demand their surrender. The fleet moved forward, 12 warships in perfect formation. They passed the outer planets of the system, great balls of gas that swirled with ancient storms. They passed a belt of asteroids, the debris of a world that had never formed. They approached the blue planet called Earth. Admiral, the sensor officer's voice had changed. There was something in it that had never heard before. I'm detecting movement. Behind the gas giant, multiple signatures. How many ships? The officer's claws trembled as she worked her console. Admiral, the sensors must be malfunctioning. They're showing thousands of contacts. Admiral opened his mouth to demand a proper count. He never got the chance. Space itself seemed to tear open as ships poured from behind the massive gas giant. They came in waves, in swarms, in numbers that made no sense. The hegemony's sensors screamed warnings as they tried to track targets that moved with impossible coordination. All ships battle formation, roared. Target the largest vessels, fire at will. The crushing tide's plasma cannons opened up, joined by the weapons of 11 other warships. They had enough firepower to crack a moon. They had destroyed fleets 10 times their number in past campaigns. The human swarm didn't slow down. Ships moved around their plasma bursts like water flowing around stones. When hegemony weapons did connect, the human vessels simply ceased to exist, but 10 more took their place. And then the humans started firing back. Admiral watched 3 of his ships vanish in the first exchange, then 4 more. His tactical display became a mess of static and warning symbols. Someone was screaming over the communication channel. Someone else was praying to gods that the hegemony had outlawed centuries ago. Send a message to the Emperor, ordered, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his hearts. Tell him. A human ship, no larger than a shuttle, punched through the crushing tide's shields like they weren't there. The bridge erupted in fire and chaos. The last image transmitted back to the hegemony showed Admiral's face frozen, in an expression his species had no word for. The intelligence analysts who reviewed the footage would later create a new term for it. They called it impossible terror. The message lasted 11 seconds, then there was only static. In his throne room, 1,000 light-years away, Emperor IX stared at a blank screen. For the first time in his long reign, he felt something cold moving through his blood. The primitives had destroyed his fleet in 11 seconds. What had the hegemony awakened? The War Council chamber had not seen so many high-ranking officers since the subjugation, 200 years ago. Admirals and generals filled every seat, their scales showing the muted grays of extreme stress. Emperor sat at the head of the table, his 4 eyes moving from face to face, searching for answers that no one could provide. 12 warships, he said quietly. 12 of our finest vessels destroyed in seconds, and none of you can tell me how. Admiral Supreme, the highest-ranking military officer in the hegemony, stood to address the council. She was old by standards, her scales faded to a dignified silver, but her mind remained sharp. She had conquered 6 worlds in her career. She had never lost a battle. The transmission was too brief for detailed analysis. Great Emperor, we know only that the humans possess ships in numbers we did not anticipate. Our estimates suggested their population could support perhaps 100 vessels. They appear to have thousands. How is this possible? A younger admiral demanded. They were primitives, burning fossil fuels and fighting among themselves. That was 300 years ago, replied. We made an error. We assumed they would develop as other species have developed. We were wrong." Emperor slammed his fist against the table, cracking the polished surface. "I want every ship in the hegemony mobilized. 400 warships will assemble at the Nexus. If these humans want war, we will show them what war truly means." The admirals began to discuss fleet deployments and supply lines. Officers argued over defensive positions and attack formations. The war machine of the hegemony, dormant for so long, began to stir. Then every screen in the chamber flickered. The image that appeared was strange to eyes. A human female, small and soft-looking, with dark hair pulled back from her face. She wore a uniform of deep blue, decorated with symbols the hegemony's translation systems could not interpret. Behind her, other humans worked at stations and consoles. "My name is Admiral Wei," she said. "I am speaking on behalf of the United Earth Defense Coalition." Her voice was calm, almost gentle. It made Scales itch. 300 years ago, your empire sent a scout ship to our world. They looked at us and saw primitives, animals, resources to be harvested when convenient. They placed a beacon in our sky like a collar on a pet and moved on to more important matters." Admiral paused, and something changed in her eyes. The gentleness remained, but beneath it was something harder, something that had been sharpened over centuries. "We found your beacon within 10 years. Our scientists studied it. Our engineers took it apart and learned its secrets. And then our leaders made a decision. We would not announce ourselves to the galaxy. We would not seek contact with your hegemony or any other power. We would prepare." The War Council sat in stunned silence. On the screen, Admiral continued. "For 300 years we have watched your empire. We have placed listening devices in your communication networks. We have studied your ships, your weapons, your tactics. We have learned about the people, worked to death in your minds. We have learned about the whose children you steal as servants. We have learned about every species you have conquered, every atrocity you have committed, every life you have crushed beneath your rule." She leaned forward slightly, and felt a chill run through his body despite the warm chamber. "We spent 3 centuries preparing for this moment, not because we feared you. We stopped fearing you generations ago. We prepared because we wanted to be certain. We wanted to be ready. We wanted there to be no doubt about what would happen when we finally came for you." Admiral's voice dropped lower, but somehow it seemed louder than before. "The hegemony has one choice now. You can surrender. You can dismantle your empire, free the species you have enslaved, and face justice for your crimes. Or you can fight." She smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I hope you choose to fight." The transmission ended. The screens returned to normal, showing fleet positions and supply routes and all the comfortable data of military planning. But no one was looking at the screens anymore. "How did they broadcast that?" someone asked. "Our communication systems are encrypted. That should have been impossible." "Trace the signal," ordered. "Find out how they accessed our networks." A communications officer worked frantically at her console. After several minutes, she looked up with fear in her eyes. "Great Emperor, the message did not come from outside our networks. It came from inside. The humans have placed transmitters throughout our systems. We are finding them in relay stations, in satellites, even in some of our ships. They have been there for decades at least, perhaps longer." The realization settled over the War Council like a funeral shroud. The humans had not simply developed faster-than-light travel. They had been watching the hegemony for over a century. Every strategic discussion, every fleet movement, every secret plan had been observed and recorded by an enemy they had forgotten existed. "They know everything," Admiral Suprema said softly. "They know where our fleets are stationed. They know our defensive positions. They know our supply lines." She turned to face the Emperor, and for the first time in her long career, she looked afraid. "Great Emperor, we are not facing a war. We are facing an execution." Emperor stood slowly. His scales had gone pale, the color of shock and fury mixed together. He had ruled the hegemony for 60 years. He had never known defeat. He refused to know it now. "Assemble the Grand Armada," he commanded. 400 ships at the Nexus. The humans may have watched us, but watching is not the same as fighting. They have never faced the full might of the hegemony. They do not understand what they have challenged. The admirals rose to carry out his orders. Ships began moving across 40 star systems, the greatest military mobilization in hegemony history. 400 warships, crewed by species that had spent generations learning the arts of war. On a small blue planet at the edge of the galaxy, Admiral Wei watched the hegemony's fleet movements on her own screens. Every ship, every course, every arrival time displayed in perfect detail. "They're doing exactly what we expected," her tactical officer reported, "concentrating their forces at the Nexus." Nodded slowly. "They think in terms of territory, and they fight the same way they have fought for 1,000 years." She turned to face her command staff, men and women whose grandparents had begun this work. "Signal the fleet. It's time to show them how humans wage war." Across the Sol system, engines began to glow. Thousands of ships stirred from hidden positions. In the asteroid belt, behind the gas giants, in the dark spaces between worlds where no one had thought to look. Humanity was coming, and they had been ready for a very long time. The Nexus was the most important strategic position in the hegemony. 3 major hyperspace routes met at this point in space, creating a crossroads that any invasion force would need to pass through. For 1,000 years, the hegemony had kept this Nexus secure. No enemy had ever breached it. Admiral Supreme stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, the largest warship ever built by hands. Around her, 400 vessels held formation, their weapons charged and their crews ready for battle. Plasma cannons that could cut through mountains, antimatter torpedoes that could crack the crust of a planet, shield generators powerful enough to withstand a supernova. This was the might of the hegemony. This was the force that had conquered 40 worlds. "All ships report ready," Admiral Supreme, her second-in-command, announced. "The humans must pass through this Nexus to reach our core systems. When they arrive, we will destroy them." A nodded, but her thoughts were troubled. The human transmission had disturbed her more than she wanted to admit. They had been watching for over a century. They knew everything about hegemony tactics, hegemony weapons, hegemony strategy. What would she do if she were the humans? Would she attack through the Nexus, where the enemy was strongest? No, she would not. "Expand our sensor range," she ordered suddenly. "Check all approach vectors, not just the primary routes." Her officers exchanged confused glances, but they obeyed. The sensors swept outward, searching the darkness of space for any sign of the approaching enemy. "Admiral Supreme," the sensor officer reported, "I'm detecting hyperspace distortions, multiple points." He paused, checking his readings again. 14 entry points, Admiral. They're not coming through the Nexus at all." Space tore open in 14 places at once. Human ships poured through each opening, spreading across the system like a swarm of insects disturbed from their nest. The hegemony sensors tried to count them, but the numbers kept climbing. 1,000, 2,000, 5,000. The display became a chaos of warning lights and proximity alerts. "That's impossible," A's second-in-command whispered. "No species has ever fielded so many vessels." Admiral Suprema watched the swarm spread, and she understood something terrible. The hegemony had spent 1,000 years conquering other species by overwhelming them with superior technology and numbers. Now they faced an enemy that had taken 3 centuries to prepare specifically for this fight. "All ships defensive formation," she commanded. "Concentrate fire on the largest targets. Do not let them surround us." The battle began. Plasma cannons fired in streams of brilliant light, cutting through the darkness. Human ships exploded by the dozens, but there were always more. They moved with a coordination that seemed impossible, each vessel knowing exactly where every other vessel would be. When the hegemony concentrated fire on a group, the humans simply flowed around the attack like water around a stone. When the hegemony spread their fire to cover more targets, human formations punched through the weak points with devastating precision. They're not fighting like a fleet, A realized. They're fighting like a single organism. A human ship, no larger than a transport shuttle, slipped through the Eternal Dominion's defensive fire and slammed directly into a neighboring cruiser. The explosion took out 3 more ships caught in the blast radius. "They're using suicide attacks," her second-in-command asked in horror. "No," I studied the tactical display with growing dread. "Those ships have no life signs. They're automated. The humans aren't sending their people to die. They're sending machines." The realization spread through the hegemony fleet like a disease. They were not fighting human warriors. They were fighting human creations, artificial minds that did not fear death, did not hesitate, did not make the small errors that living beings always made under pressure. 3 hours into the battle, the hegemony had lost 100 ships. The human swarm had lost perhaps 500, but they had thousands more, and they kept coming. A transmission cut through the chaos of battle. Admiral Wei's face appeared on every hegemony screen. "You're wondering about our ships," she said, as if she were discussing the weather. "You've realized they're automated, but that word doesn't quite capture what they are." Behind her, the bridge of her flagship hummed with activity. Unlike the swarm, her vessel carried a human crew. I understood that Wei wanted to be present for this, wanted to see it with her own eyes. 3 centuries ago, humans created our first artificial intelligences. Simple things at first, tools to help us solve problems, but we kept improving them, teaching them, raising them like children. The ships you're fighting aren't just machines. They're our children, our sons and daughters made of metal and light instead of flesh and blood. They volunteered for this mission. They chose to fight for humanity. Wei smiled, and there was genuine warmth in her expression. "We don't send our children to die for us. We send them to protect us, and they do so willingly because that's what family does." The transmission ended. Admiral Suprema looked at her tactical display. Half her fleet was gone. The human swarm was closing in from all directions, moving with that terrible coordination that no living crew could match. "Admiral Supreme," her communications officer called out, "Emperor demands a status report." I laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "Tell the Emperor that his fleet is being destroyed by the children of primitives. Tell him that we face an enemy that has spent 3 centuries preparing for this exact moment, while we spent the same time believing ourselves invincible." She turned to her surviving commanders. "All ships retreat, fall back to the. We cannot win this battle, but perhaps we can prepare a defense." The remaining hegemony vessels broke formation and fled into hyperspace. The human swarm did not pursue. They held their position at the nexus, watching the enemy retreat. On her flagship, Admiral watched the last hegemony ships disappear. Her tactical officer approached with a report. "Losses: 847 vessels destroyed. All AI crews have been backed up and can be restored to new hulls. We have no permanent casualties." Nodded and the hegemony. 312 ships destroyed, 83 survivors retreating to their. Good. Turned to face her crew, men and women whose ancestors had looked up at the stars and dreamed of this day. "The Empire knows we're coming now. They know we can beat them, but we're not going to chase them to there. We have something more important to do first." She activated the fleet-wide communication system. Thousands of ships waited for her orders. "All vessels disperse to assign liberation targets. It's time to free the galaxy." Across the hegemony, on 17 conquered worlds, slaves and servants looked up at the sky and wondered why their masters suddenly seemed so afraid. They would have their answer soon enough. On Prime, the morning shift began like every other morning for the past 200 years. Workers emerged from their underground dormitories, their stone-like skin cracked and from decades of labor. Hegemony overseers stood at every tunnel entrance, shock staves ready to punish anyone who moved too slowly. The great mines of had produced precious metals for the empire since before any living could remember. Old, named after a distant ancestor whose mathematical theories had once been famous across the galaxy, shuffled toward the mine entrance. He was 43 years old. For a under-hegemony rule, this was ancient. Most of his generation had already died, their bodies broken by endless work and careful cruelty. The sky above was gray, as it always was. Hegemony factories had poisoned the atmosphere generations ago, could not remember what the sky had looked like before. None of them could. Then the gray clouds turned bright. Ships descended through the atmosphere, dozens of them, moving with a speed and coordination that made the hegemony patrol vessels look clumsy by comparison. Watched as the patrol ships tried to intercept the intruders. They were destroyed in seconds, turned to falling debris that rained down on the distant mountains. The landing vessels touched down near the mine entrance. They were strange shapes, nothing like the angular hegemony designs. These ships had curves, smooth surfaces, markings that could not read. Doors opened and soldiers emerged. They walked on two legs like some species did, but their forms were metal and light rather than flesh. Their faces were smooth plates with glowing points where eyes should be. They carried weapons that hummed with contained energy. The hegemony overseers raised their shock staves and charged at the intruders. The metal soldiers moved faster than any living thing had ever seen. In moments, every overseer was on the ground, unconscious or restrained by glowing bands of energy. One of the metal soldiers approached the gathered workers. Its faceplate shifted, rearranging into something that almost looked like a smile. "People of," it said, its voice carrying across the crowd without needing to shout. "Earth sends greetings. We have come to free you." A murmur passed through the workers. Some thought it was a trick. Some thought they had gone mad from mine gas. Old simply stared, his ancient mind trying to understand what he was seeing. "You have heard of Earth?" another worker asked. "We have heard of you," the metal soldier replied. "We have heard of the mathematician whose theorems form the foundation of our faster-than-light technology. His final transmissions, smuggled out before the hegemony silenced your world, reached us. We learned of your suffering. We learned of the Empire's crimes. And we spent 300 years preparing to answer." The metal soldier gestured, and more of its kind emerged from the ships, carrying containers and equipment. They began setting up stations throughout the area, distributing packets that turned out to be food, actual food, not the nutrient paste the hegemony provided. "We do not ask you to fight," the soldier continued. "We do not ask you to risk yourselves. We ask only that you survive and remember, the hegemony's rule over your world ends today." Across the planet, the same scene played out again and again. Human forces landed at mining camps, processing facilities, detention centers. They brought food, medicine, communication devices that allowed to speak to family members they had not seen in decades. They destroyed hegemony infrastructure with precise strikes that avoided civilian areas. The same thing happened on Prime, where generations of children had been taken from their families to serve as household servants for hegemony nobility. Human forces surrounded the training facilities where young were taught to obey and fear. The instructors were captured. The children were freed. Many of them did not know their own names, only the designations their masters had given them. Human counselors, flesh and blood humans who had traveled with the AI soldiers, began the long work of helping them recover. On world after world, the pattern repeated. Human forces arrived not as conquerors but as liberators. They destroyed the apparatus of oppression, the guard stations and surveillance networks and punishment facilities. They shared technology freely, showing conquered peoples how to repair their own ships, grow their own food, defend their own worlds. And everywhere they went, they brought cameras. The footage spread across the galaxy through communication networks the hegemony thought they controlled, walking free under open sky for the first time in generations. Parents reunited with children they had thought lost forever. Species that had been ground beneath the hegemony's heel for centuries, standing tall and unafraid. Emperor watched the broadcasts from his throne room, his scales pale with a fury he could not express. His empire was crumbling, not through military defeat, but through something far more dangerous. Hope. On a dozen worlds, slave populations began to rise. Workers refused to enter the mines. Servants walked away from their masters. Soldiers from conquered species, forced to serve in hegemony military units, turned their weapons on their commanders. Recall all fleets to the ordered. Abandon the outer systems. We must concentrate our defenses. His advisors looked at each other in shock. Abandoning territory was unthinkable. The hegemony had never retreated, never surrendered ground. Great Emperor, one brave soul ventured, if we abandon the outer systems, we lose access to vital resources. Our industrial capacity will collapse within a year. If we do not defend we will collapse within a month. His voice was cold, but beneath it was something his advisors had never heard before: fear. The humans are not trying to conquer our territory. They are trying to destroy our ability to rule. They are turning our subjects against us. They are proving that our power was always an illusion. He stood from his throne and walked to the great window that overlooked the imperial capital. Millions of citizens went about their daily lives below, unaware that their empire was dying. We built our rule on fear, said quietly. We taught every species in our domain that resistance was futile, that the hegemony was invincible. The humans have shown them otherwise. They have shown them that empires can fall. He turned back to his advisors, and his expression hardened. We will make our stand at we will gather every ship, every weapon, every soldier that remains loyal. And when the humans come, we will show them that they do not surrender. We will show them that some things cannot be freed. The remaining hegemony fleet began to withdraw from across the galaxy, abandoning systems they had held for centuries. Behind them, newly liberated species watched them go and began to rebuild their worlds. On her flagship, Admiral received reports from across the liberation campaign. 17 worlds freed. Millions of beings no longer living under hegemony rule. Resources and technology shared that would help them defend themselves for generations to come. The Emperor is consolidating his forces at her tactical officer reported. 83 warships, plus whatever local defense forces they can muster. Nodded slowly. He's going to make a final stand. He wants to prove that the hegemony can still fight. Should we pursue? We have overwhelming numbers. Not yet. Studied the tactical display, thinking of all the species who had suffered under hegemony rule, all the lives lost, all the potential destroyed. First, I want to give our new allies a choice. They have more right to witness this than we do. Messages went out to the liberated worlds. Ships that had been hidden for generations, preserved by resistance movements who never stopped hopping, began to emerge from secret locations. Vessels, cruisers, ships from a dozen species, all of them preparing to join the human fleet. The final battle would not be humanity against the hegemony. It would be the galaxy against its oppressor. And the galaxy was ready. They had never known war. For 1,000 years, the battles of the hegemony had been fought in distant systems, on conquered worlds, in spaces far removed from the gleaming cities and ancient monuments of the imperial capital. The population had grown comfortable in their security, confident that the military might of their species would protect them forever. Now they watched the sky and waited for the end. 83 warships formed a defensive sphere around the planet, the last remnants of a fleet that had once numbered in the hundreds. Admiral Suprema commanded from the Eternal Dominion, her crew exhausted but determined. They would not win this battle. Everyone knew this. But they would fight, because that was all they had left. Emperor stood in his throne room, alone for the first time in his reign. His advisors had fled or been arrested for suggesting surrender. His guards remained at their posts, loyal to the end, but even they could not hide the fear in their scales. "They are coming," a communications officer announced through the chamber speakers. Multiple hyperspace signatures detected at the system edge. Walk to the great window. In the distance, barely visible against the stars, points of light began to appear, first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, but they were not alone. Beside them flew ships of every design, vessels from the 17 species the hegemony had conquered. Mining haulers converted into warships. Courier vessels armed with weapons their masters had forbidden them to possess. Ships that had been hidden and preserved for generations, waiting for this exact moment. The fleet of the oppressed had come to face their oppressor. Admiral Wei's flagship led the formation, flanked by vessels from a dozen worlds. She studied the hegemony defensive formation and felt a strange mixture of emotions. Triumph, certainly, justice, finally within reach, but also something like sadness. So much destruction, so much suffering, all because one species had decided they had the right to rule others. "Admiral," her communications officer reported, "we're receiving a transmission from the hegemony flagship. Admiral Suprema wishes to speak with you." Nodded, put her through. A's face appeared on the screen. She looked old, realized, older than she had seemed in the intelligence reports. The weight of defeat hung on her like a physical burden. "Admiral," A said, "I will not insult you with pleas for mercy or offers of surrender. We both know how this ends. But I would ask one thing from one military commander to another." "Ask." "When you destroy our fleet, do not attack the civilian population. The people of our are not soldiers. They did not choose the crimes of our empire. They simply lived within it as any people would." Studied the old admiral for a long moment. "You conquered 17 worlds. You enslaved billions of beings. Your people lived in comfort built on the suffering of others, and now you ask for mercy." "I ask for wisdom," A replied. "You have already won. The galaxy will never forget what humanity has done here. If you burn our cities and kill our civilians, you will be remembered as liberators who became conquerors. If you spare them, you will be remembered as something else entirely." The transmission ended. Turned to her command staff. Officers from Earth stood alongside representatives from the liberated worlds. A commander whose ancestors had been worked to death in hegemony mines. A captain who had spent her childhood as a slave in a noble household. They had all earned the right to be here. "What do we do?" asked them. "The final decision belongs to all of us." The captain spoke first. "I grew up serving masters. I remember their cruelty, their casual contempt for anything that was not themselves. Part of me wants to watch their world burn." She paused, her expression thoughtful. "But I also remember the servants who showed me kindness when no one was watching, the young ones who had not yet learned to hate. If we destroy them all, we become what we have been fighting against." The commander nodded slowly. "My people remember, whose theories helped humanity reach the stars. He believed that mathematics was the language of the universe, and that any being who learned to speak it could understand truth. The truth is that revenge will not restore what we have lost. Only building something better can do that." Admiral looked at each member of her command staff in turn. They had come so far, sacrificed so much, and now they faced the most important choice of all. "All ships," she said finally, "target hegemony military vessels only. Civilian targets are prohibited. We came to end an empire, not to commit genocide." The battle began. It was short and brutal. The hegemony fleet fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered 10-1. Ships exploded in brilliant flowers of light. Escape pods scattered across the void. Admiral Supreme A's flagship was the last to fall, its shields finally failing under the combined fire of a dozen vessels. When it was over, the sky above them was empty of defenders. Fleet descended through the atmosphere, landing craft touching down across the imperial capital. Human soldiers moved through the streets, accompanied by forces from the liberated worlds. They secured government buildings. They shut down military installations. They broadcast messages of calm to a terrified population. Emperor was found in his throne room, standing before the great window, watching the invaders take control of his city. He did not resist when they came for him. There was no point. They brought him to a plaza in the center of the capital, where a platform had been erected. Waiting on that platform were representatives from every species the hegemony had conquered. Others, whose names the galaxy had almost forgotten. "You will face trial," told him. "Not a human trial. Your fate will be decided by those you wronged." Looked at the gathered representatives, beings his empire had treated as property for generations. "They will execute me." "Perhaps that is their right." Stepped closer, her voice dropping low enough that only he could hear. "You could have been remembered differently. Your empire could have built something magnificent, something that lifted all species instead of crushing them. You had 1,000 years and unlimited power, and this is what you created." She turned away, leaving the former emperor to face his accusers. The trials lasted for months, and his high officials were judged by those they had oppressed. Some were executed. Others were sentenced to labor, repairing the damage they had caused. A few, those who had secretly worked to ease the suffering of conquered peoples, were shown mercy. The hegemony was dismantled, its territory reorganized into a confederation of free worlds. A new council was formed, with representatives from every species, including themselves. They would have to earn their place in the new order, but they would have the chance to try. 1 year after the battle, Admiral stood on a balcony overlooking the plaza where the trials had been held. A delegate approached her, the same old who had been freed from the minds of his. "I never asked you," said. "Your fleet could have conquered the galaxy. You proved yourselves the strongest. By every law the hegemony followed, this was your right." Smiled. "Humanity spent 3 centuries preparing to fight this war, but we spent just as long debating what kind of species we wanted to be when we won. And what did you decide? That strength without wisdom is just another form of tyranny." She looked out at the city, where citizens walked alongside beings from a dozen worlds, learning to see each other as equals. "We didn't come to replace the hegemony. We came to prove there was a better way." Below them, children of different species played together in the plaza, their laughter echoing off ancient walls. They would grow up in a galaxy without masters and slaves, without empires built on suffering. They would inherit a universe where strength was measured not by the ability to conquer, but by the wisdom to build. In the end, humanity's greatest victory was not the destruction of the hegemony's fleet or the capture of their emperor. It was the choice they made when they had the power to become exactly what they had destroyed. They chose to be something better. And the galaxy would never be the same.